Without further ado, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marika. And for those of you who don't know, Marika was cutting a DA at 10 o'clock last night, so she's done a fantastic job to get here to chair the session today. It's a great pleasure to be here in Ireland. It feels as if I've actually come home. My family came out to Australia in 1841 from just up the road at Cookstown, County Tyrone. I'm going to talk today about findings and understanding that we have recently gained in Northern Australia about how to manage live weight production from beef breeding herds. And although the findings are derived from a study of extensively managed beef herds, the principles that I'm going to outline, I believe, apply to all beef breeding herds. To start with, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Jeff Fordyce, Dave Smith and Kieran McCosker. On the left-hand side, the Cash Cow project team, and in particular, the group of producers here that participated in this 4-year study involving the monitoring of the reproductive performance of some 78,000 beef breeding cows to, in the first instance, to determine what were the major factors affecting the likelihood of cows becoming pregnant and then the likelihood of pregnant cows weaning a calf. But during the course of this study, we gained an understanding of a more holistic approach that needs to be utilised when evaluating the essential question, which is, how is my beef breeding business going? So that's what I'm going to focus on through a series of questions. So let's start, and this is a question that cattle veterinarians need to be asking their clients or encouraging their clients to think about, ask, how is my beef or how is my breeding farm going? So I've given you 2 examples of where I see things are at. On the left-hand side here, we've got a pig farm. And if you asked the manager of a pig farm how things were going, he'd tell you something like 11 piglets born alive per litre, 2.25 litres per sow per year. If you asked the typical beef cattle farmer how his beef farm was going, he'd probably tell you something like, well, my pregnancy rate was pretty good, it was about 90%, or my weaning rate was about 80%. My question is, which set of data enables me to estimate how many kilograms of pork or beef is my beef breeding or pork breeding operation producing annually? And it's pretty obvious that it is this kind of data here, numbers of offspring produced annually. Because at the end of the day, our farmers are paid on the basis of numbers of animals produced or kilos of live weight produced. They're not paid for a pregnancy rate. So that's the first thing that I want us to be starting to think about. We need to move from an assessment of how your beef breeding farm is going, one based on measures such as these, to one based on measures such as kilos of beef produced. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. If we look at this simple equation, and that's the important thing that we need to have front and centre in our mind, profitability. Profitability equals production times value of product minus cost of production. What we as cattle veterinarians need to be focusing on is how we can improve productivity and how we can reduce cost of production. We need to move from being simply technicians doing specific tasks like conducting pregnancy diagnosis to one where we utilise the findings from pregnancy diagnosis and fetal ageing to enhance production, to reduce cost of production, and in so doing, increase profitability of the beef breeding businesses under our care. So let's look at live weight production from breeding herds. The concept of live weight production is that over a 1-year production cycle, a cow's production, if she remains alive, is the sum of her weight change and the weight of any weaned calf. All right? So in this little cartoon here, hit the wrong button. In this little cartoon here, we start typically at the time of when we conduct pregnancy diagnosis and we determine how many breeding females we'll retain for the next year. Then 12 months later, we may have some cull cows. We will have some calves that were weaned. We may have experienced some mortalities. But this amount here is what our live weight production is. Because remember, we're going to retain some of these weaned females, and in some cases weaned males, as replacement breeding heifers, breeding bulls. In other words, it is just like a pig farm, right? We're managing a flow of live weight production from each of our farms. So in another way of putting it, if a farmer puts 100 tonne of cows in a paddock after completing pregnancy diagnosis of the herd, then 12 months later, how many tonnes of beef have been harvested from the herd? And that'll include calves that are weaned, cows and bulls that are sold. So how do you go about measuring live weight production from a beef breeding farm? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. All you need to be able to do is count cattle according to their specific age classes, and I've given you some examples of age classes here that you can utilise. These are the typical age classes that we utilise in Northern Australia. And you need an average weight of each class of cattle. Now, you make a measurement at the commencement of your cattle year, and in Northern Australia, our cattle year conveniently starts, as I said before, at the time we conduct pregnancy diagnosis. 12 months later, you do the same again, and from that, we can feed that information into some simple spreadsheet programs that my colleague Jeff Fordyce and an economist, Phil Holmes, have developed, and from that, we can develop a series of measures of live weight production. Now, you can also add to that measures of income, measures of cost of production, and ultimately generate important production indices or business indices such as operating margin. But I won't be covering that today. So what are the major drivers of live weight production of a beef breeding herd? And I've outlined them here. The first is the percentage of lactating cows that become pregnant within 4 months of calving. What that provides is an estimate of the proportion of cows likely to wean a calf in consecutive years. Then, the annual total percentage of cows that do in fact become pregnant, the percentage of fetal and calf loss that occurs between pregnancy diagnosis and weaning, the average weight of weaned calves. So certainly we need to be encouraging our producers to either weigh or wean calves. So in the smaller herds, that's quite feasible. In our larger herds, we simply weigh a cross-sectional sample of calves weaned. Similarly, we need an estimate of the live weight change of the heifers and cows that we started with and then 12 months later. And critically, the occurrence of mortalities, the percentage of heifer and cow mortality. And that's certainly in our extensive rangeland beef herds, that is a big issue. So using this annual live weight production approach as your primary measure of how is a beef herd going, it encourages a much more holistic approach to herd management. If you're just talking about pregnancy rates and weaning rates, well, certainly in our northern systems, and these systems are typical of rangeland beef production across the tropical semi-arid regions of the world, then one of the areas that you will be missing is this critical area of mortality. So we've now covered how we go about estimating live weight production from beef breeding herds. We've talked about what are the major drivers of live weight production. What producers need to know, farmers need to know, is what level of live weight production should they be achieving from their breeding herds? What level of live weight production is sustainable? In this very large project that we conducted across Northern Australia, we asked a simple question. And the question was, if you grazed typical yearling steers on the pastures where you were grazing your breeding cows, how much live weight would those steers put on in a 12-month period? That was the question. And we then examined that using one of our measures of live weight production, which is weaner production. Now, weaner production is very simply the number of calves weaned times the average weight of the weaned calves divided by the total number of cows retained at the commencement of the cattle year. So we've now graphed this out. So on the x-axis here, you can see the reported annual steer growth ranging from 100 kgs up to 250 kgs, and weaner production here. And what you can see is there's quite a nice relationship. And so what we're increasingly becoming confident about is that the estimate of annual growth of steers on the pastures or being fed whatever you feed your breeding cows over a 12-month period. So here in Europe, this could include both pastures and conserved forage. But whatever your total feed resource is, if you fed that to yearling steers, how many kilos would they put on in a 12-month period? And that gives you a pretty good indication of what the kilos that you should be producing per cow from your beef breeding herd. All right? So if your steers put on 100 kgs per annum, then the kilos of beef produced from a breeding herd in being fed that resource, that feed resource, should be about 100 kgs per cow. The key thing here is understanding what level of production your feed resource is capable of sustaining. That's the key. So we were able to provide some indication benchmarks for our producers in Northern Australia, and this is something that you could readily do yourselves. So here we've got the mean annual steer growth, and in Northern Australia it ranged from 100 to 200 kgs, and we've simply put it into percentile. So here we have the median here, the lower 25th percentile and the upper 25th percentile. And as you can see, if you look at the 200 kilo mean annual steer growth, what was being achieved as far as weaner production, the median performance was 191 kg. So you can see there's quite a good relationship. In other words, that simple measure, and something that your farmers could readily do, provides you with an indication of what your feed resource is capable of sustaining with respect your beef breeding herd. Now, commonly, your beef farmers will say to you when you're talking to them, I know we've had an excellent year. Average weight of my wean calves is 250 kgs. And does that tell you how well that beef breeding herd's going? Well, let's have a look at this simple example. My property is in an area of poor soil fertility. And it was interesting to hear that here in the Green Island that phosphorus deficiency occurs. And phosphorus deficiency is a major problem for us in Northern Australia, and particularly in areas where the annual estimated steer growth is only 100 kgs. So this is our example. I aim to achieve an average weight of 150 kgs for my wean calves. So I make the decision to wean my calves when I estimate that on average they're about 150 kgs. Do you see the problem? My country is capable of supporting 100 kgs of live weight production, and I am extracting 150 kgs per cow. So where's the missing 50 kgs come from? Where do you think it's come from? Well, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's come off the cow's back, right? To achieve that average weaner weight, the cow will have had to mobilise body fat and muscle reserves to produce this growth. And what are the consequences? Well, the consequences are that this cow has lost almost a full body condition score using a 1 to 5 scale. So that cow has a lower chance of becoming pregnant within 4 months of calving, or it has a lower chance of weaning a calf because of problems with regards milk production, survival of the calf. So it demonstrates, and I'll come back to this in a moment, this important principle that decisions on weaning need to be made not on some target weaning weight, but rather on the basis of cow body condition. And this is a critically important principle, and it applies wherever you operate. Now, you'll say, okay, this is all very well, work's been done in Northern Australia, would it apply here? So I spoke to one of my colleagues, runs a practice up at Kelso in the Scottish Borders, Robert Anderson, and I said to him, okay, this is our thinking, current thinking on how to evaluate the performance of beef breeding businesses. And I ran it past him. And I said, okay, in your part of the world, what if you ran steers on the country where you run your beef breeding cows, how many kilos would they put on in a 12-month period? And not surprisingly, he said about 300 kgs. It's seriously good country. So we then did a simple little study. And so I said, well, if you achieved a genuine weaning rate of 80%, that is, of the cows exposed to a bull, 80% produced a weaner, then if we use that, all right, then the weaner production for that herd would be 240 kgs. In other words, we now have some information that says if that country is capable of supporting 300 kilos in steer growth, then it should be generating 300 kilos per cow in live weight production. So 240 kgs is less than what it should be producing. There may be a problem. So, the large project that we conducted in Northern Australia, similar to the large project conducted in Eastern Australia in the dairy industry, enabled us to identify the major factors affecting the likelihood of cows becoming pregnant and the likelihood of pregnant cows weaning a calf. The key things now for us are to identify management strategies that producers, farmers can utilise to improve their live weight production. And the approach that we've taken is to group these management strategies into 4 broad areas. And the broad areas are managing the feed base, all right, not too much feed here, managing lactation, managing cattle health and stress. Can anyone see what's going on here? It's a bit of a worrying sight, all right? Cows consuming a carcass. Classical risk factor for botulism. Common problem in our phosphorus deficient country across Northern Australia. And the 4th area is managing breeding. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of those 4 management strategies or broad areas of management strategy. So the first is managing the feed base. And as cattle veterinarians, we need to get a good understanding of how you grow and manage pasture. It's critical to the whole operation. Producers need to be able to budget available feed to meet short and medium-term cattle requirements. What we find is the difference between good farmers and less successful farmers is in the timeliness of their decision making. Those farmers who have determined that their feed supply will only last for, say, another 4 months in the absence of rain during the wet season, if they'll set a time by which rainfall must occur. If it doesn't, they move the cattle off to another property where there is grass, all right? The farmer who keeps waiting for rain, thinking it will come, doesn't use any feed budgeting. As a result, then the pasture is chewed out and he then is faced with total supplementation. It's a recipe for going broke. The other key areas is good grazing management. you need to critically determine what is the sustainable stocking rate for each paddock. Let me say that overgrazing of pastures is a sin. And it leads to irreversible, particularly in the fragile soils that we have across Northern Australia. It leads to irreversible damage to the soils and to the pastures. We need to limit grazing distance from water. Possibly not so much a problem here in Europe, but in the more extensive grazing areas, it's critical that you have multiple watering points across a large 90 square kilometre paddock to enable cattle to efficiently utilise all the available pasture in the paddock. If there's only a few watering points, then much of the grazing area will not be utilised. You need to use supplements that augment sound grazing management, all right? Augment sound grazing management, not replace, all right? Supplements are expensive. You need to feed supplements only to those animals that actually need it. And so this is where pregnancy diagnosis and fetal ageing enables us to determine which cows are in the last trimester of pregnancy, will need appropriate levels of energy and protein to meet those increasing requirements of fetal growth and initiation of lactation, compared to earlier first trimester females or non-pregnant females. Managing lactation. As I said before, the key is to manage wean to conserve body condition. Timing of weaning is really important. We need, in areas where we've got very distinct differences in seasonal quality and quantity of pasture, which is typical of tropical grazing systems, where you have a wet and a dry season. What is important is that weaning take place at a time when there's still sufficient quantity and quality of pasture available to that cow for that cow to re-aliment. In other words, to recover the body condition that she lost during the lactation period, to recover phosphorus reserves and other mineral reserves, so that she's then set up for the next production cycle. Critical. We need to use pregnancy diagnosis and fetal ageing, as I said before, to segregate cattle for different nutritional management and efficient weaning. If you, and again, it's more common in the extensive rangeland areas where you have continuous mating, all right, or in areas where you have long periods of mating, such as the order of 6 to 7 months. In those systems, using fetal ageing, you can group cows into 3-month calving periods. So in other words, you go in and you identify cows that are going to calve in the next 3 months, the next 3 to 6 months, and the next 6 to 9 months. So now you have effectively 3 control-mated herds. And by doing that, you can then ensure that supplements are fed at the right time. You can also ensure that weaning is done at the right time. Wherever possible, mating should be controlled, particularly with heifers. You want one of the key strategies with controlled mating is ensuring that heifers and cows calve close to the time when the likelihood of significant improvements in seasonal pasture quantity and quality is high. Having cows and heifers calve at times when pasture quality is poor is a disaster. So this is just one example of utilising the findings from these large epidemiological studies that we've conducted. And here we have the findings on the impact of phosphorus deficiency. So here we have a high risk of P deficiency. This is the green line. The orange line is a low risk of P deficiency. And here we have the different classes of cattle. And this is the percent in calf within 4 months of calving. And as you can see, in the first lactation cows where there's a high risk of phosphorus deficiency, there was a 24% lower in calf within 4 months compared to those cows where there was a low risk of phosphorus deficiency. There was also lower performance in the older cows. But what this tells us is if we're in phosphorus deficient country, then the group of females that most need phosphorus supplementation during the lactation period, during the wet season, is our first lactation cows. Managing cattle health and stress. The approach I take is a very simple one. It's a risk-based approach. I look at diseases that are likely to cause death of animals, e.g. botulism or tick fever. I look at diseases that may cause illness. In our part of the world, that might be the arthropod-borne disease, bovine ephemeral fever. And then I look at diseases that cause reduced reproductive performance. So this could be BVDV, it could be vibriosis trichomoniasis. But it's a risk-based approach. And the primary thing you want to be assessing is what is the likelihood of introduction of disease, what is the immune status of that group of females. And on the basis of that, you make a decision. So it's quite routine in our part of the world to, with regards control of BVDV, and we're in control at the stage, we're not into eradication, is to take a cross-sectional blood samples from replacement heifers, test those for antibodies. If the majority of females are already seropositive, then we will not vaccinate them. They have lifelong immunity. No point in vaccinating those. If the percentage seropositive is low, then we will consider vaccination. We need to provide protection from environmental extremes, floods, blizzards, etc., for our young calves and their dams. We need to think about the paddock that we put them in. We advise against handling females in the last month of pregnancy and in the first month of calving, particularly in extensive systems because it increases the rate of fetal calf loss. And where possible, we need to conduct castration and dehorning when calves are young and according to best practice. That will reduce mortality rates. Key management practices with regards breeding. My approach is to, as far as improving performance of beef breeding herds, is to put in place two parallel strategies. One is a long-term strategy, which is my genetic improvement strategy, and the second is improvements in management practices. So looking at the genetic improvements, we need to be focused on selection of bulls based on fertility traits, in harsh environments, adaptation traits, and certainly in our part of the world for the key trait, which is poledness, because we want to change our Northern Australian beef herd from one that is predominantly horned to one that is predominantly poled, and that will dramatically improve the welfare of those cattle and reduce mortalities. We need to select bulls that have passed a breeding soundness examination. We need to select bulls that have met the minimum standards for scrotal circumference according to Liveweight. and have greater than 70% morphologically normal sperm. It's critical that when we introduce new bulls to the property that there is an acclimatisation. We manage those to minimise problems such as significant loss of body condition. Herd bulls should undergo an annual bull breeding soundness examination. I don't have time to address the areas of reducing cost of production in any detail, but let me tell you, the low-hanging fruit are bulls. Wherever we go and have discussions with farmers, invariably we get round to talking about bulls. And invariably, they have too many bulls. In our study, there was only about a quarter of farmers that were utilising the recommendation of mating 2.5% or 2.5 bulls per 100 females, 2.5 bulls that have passed a breeding soundness examination. In fact, that's a conservative recommendation. In many places, we could be operating with 1.5%. So one of the ways that you can in establishing your consultancy with a beef breeding farm, that you can achieve some early gains as far as reducing cost of production is to examine the bull battery and conducting breeding soundness examinations, reduce the number of bulls that are being bred and the number of bulls that are annually being bought as replacements. That will dramatically reduce the cost per calf produced. I want to say a few words about this critical area, which is initiating adoption of management changes. And this has been a common thread listening to the talks throughout this Congress. We know a lot about what's required to improve performance, but where we have failed is in being able to convince farmers to adopt our changes. And if I go back 20 years, one of the big tools that was being developed that we've embraced as part of our business as cattle veterinarians was epidemiology. That's greatly improved our ability to provide quality advice. Going forward in the next 20 years, the area that we need to be focusing on is developing adoption tools, all right? Because much of what I'm talking to you about today, people like Basil Lohman from the Scottish Agricultural College, Neil Mossman from New Zealand, they were expounding these recommendations back in the 60s and 70s. And we're still struggling to get our message across. So we need to be focusing on adoption. So my key take-home messages are, firstly, we need to understand what live weight production your clients' beef breeding herds, feed resources are capable of sustaining. And we've got a practical tool that you can utilise. Annual growth of yearling steers grazing on the pastures grazed by the breeding cows. We need to measure the actual production and performance of each management group, and that's pretty straightforward. We need to understand what the key drivers of live weight production from beef breeding herds is, and we need to understand how to cost-effectively control the major factors affecting these drivers of live weight production. This image here is from the Barkly tableland, and there's a few cows on the move there, the order of 500 or 600 on the move. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for an interesting talk. Hopefully has given some food for thought, excuse the pun. This presentation is now open for questions for the audience. Can I get a bit of light in the audience so that I can actually see people, because it's kind of black for me. people have questions, will you come up to the microphone? Will you also tell where you're from, state your name and where you're from before you answer your question? Thank you. I see someone in the background. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Iber Rojas. I'm from Ireland. And thank you very much for your great presentation. My question is related with the management of the breeding and the reducing cost. What do you think about the use of the artificial insemination for improve the genetic merit in the herd and as well reducing the cost? Because, for example, if we use the artificial insemination, we could reduce as well the number of the bulls that we have in our herd. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. Yes, one of the key recommendations we make to our producers is and these are in larger herds, but also in smaller herds, to consider breeding their own bulls, as opposed to going out and buying some over-conditioned bulls that have all kinds of problems, because those bulls that they produce are typically produced from cows that are coping with their particular environment. So I totally agree. Now, what we are implementing in Northern Australia is routine artificial insemination, particularly using fixed-time AI in our heifer herds in particular, as the means by which we introduce improved genetics and particularly the pole gene into our beef breeding herds. So we see that as a key method by which we can cost-effectively improve the genetics of our beef breeding herds. So I totally agree.
And in your opinion, what will be the percentage of animals that we have to inseminate in the herd?
So I didn't quite catch that.
The percentage, for example, if we have 100 animals, in your opinion, what will be the best percentage of the insemination of those animals? 25%, 20%?
Yeah, yeah. So the approach I would take is simply this. Based on the work that was done as a very long-term genetic improvement study was done, and what it demonstrated was that the long-term production or long-term fertility was defined by whether a first lactation female reconceived while she was lactating. So the approach I would be taking is I would be going into my 100 cows and focusing on my first lactation females. I would be identifying those first lactation females, and this could be done by ultrasonography, that are cycling within 60 days of calving. They would be the group that I would then consider artificially inseminating with semen from genetically elite bulls, because those females are carrying the genetics for superior lifetime performance. In other words, they're the females that are capable of returning to cycling whilst lactating and conceiving while lactating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Now, I'm under extremely strict instructions to stay on time, so to keep an eye on that, I'm actually going to ask you to give Mike a round of applause and ask the second speaker to come up for his talk. Thank you very much.